Welcome to The Debate. We are diving into one of the most consequential legal proceedings in Western history, the trial and condemnation of Socrates by Athens. It's truly fundamental to philosophy, yet the accounts of his behavior, which come from his close students, offer profoundly different interpretations of his intentions.
Right, and that difference really hinges entirely on his defense speech, the Apology. Both sources agree Socrates was unjustly accused, but they disagree on whether his famous defense was driven by moral necessity or a kind of calculated self-preservation. It was deliberately unconventional, almost, bordering on arrogant, particularly in his refusal to use the standard emotional pleas, the weeping wife and children routine, and his truly astonishing counterproposal for punishment.
And that sharp conflict brings us to our central question. Was Socrates' defense speech the unavoidable principled expression of his philosophical commitment to truth and divine command, making his death an accepted consequence? Or was it a calculated, strategic action designed to provoke the jury into condemning him, ensuring a noble, timely exit? I'll be arguing for the former position, that his actions were dictated by philosophical integrity, aligning primarily with the more comprehensive, foundational account from his student.
And I will be taking the opposing view. I argue that Socrates made a conscious, strategic choice for death, using the trial as a final, masterful performance to cement his legacy. This perspective is laid out very clearly in the historical account that focuses more on, let's say, biographical motives and the man's practical decisions.
My position is that the idea of a calculated strategy really undermines the very core of Socratic teaching. Socrates' defense wasn't some veiled desire for death, but the necessary manifestation of his devotion to his lifelong mission. His life was his argument. He explicitly tells the jury he would obey the divine command rather than obey them, declaring, without any doubt, that he would never cease practicing philosophy, even if it meant dying multiple times. This isn't suicidal intent, it is an absolute declaration that adherence to principle is fundamentally more valuable than physical life.
A passive acceptance of a consequence. The evidence suggests a deliberate orchestration of his final moments. The historical account I'm emphasizing opens by stating very plainly that Socrates had already decided that for him, death was preferable to life. This wasn't just fatalism. It was an active choice based on a deeply human and practical rationale. He was 70 years old, and he feared he could no longer maintain his rigorous, just, and upright life. He wanted to avoid the humiliation of age, of error, of decline, preferring to go out at the top of his game without making mistakes that would discredit his lifetime of teaching.
But is that truly compatible with Socratic philosophy? If the highest value is the pursuit of knowledge and virtue, doesn't the philosopher have an ethical obligation to continue that pursuit for as long as possible, even if diminished? The very essence of his teaching, that the life which is unexamined is not worth living, it demands continuous self-scrutiny. His refusal to use emotional pleas was because that kind of conduct would be dishonorable and impious, essentially sacrificing the integrity of the law for his own preservation. He valued justice above living, embodying a consistency that, for me, defies the charge of mere arrogance.
But consistency can absolutely be a strategy. Let's look at the ultimate test case for his intentions, the penalty proposal. After being convicted, Socrates was expected to propose a realistic counter-penalty. Exile, a fine, something like that. Instead, he suggests free meals in the Prytonian, a privilege reserved for Olympic champions and Athens' greatest benefactors. This was not a realistic alternative. It was completely irrational as a legal maneuver. The account I emphasize highlights this arrogance as a direct, intentional provocation designed precisely to infuriate the jury of 501 men, guaranteeing they would vote for the maximum penalty, death.
I see why you emphasize the shock value of that moment, I do. But that proposal has to be framed through the lens of Socratic self-assessment. He genuinely believed he provided the city with the greatest good, acting as the gadfly sent by the god to arouse the sluggish Athenian state. So his reward proposal, while politically radical and certainly misunderstood, was a sincere assessment of the true value he offered the city. It wasn't a cheap trick. It was a profound assertion of self-worth consistent with his life's mission.
If he believed he deserved the greatest reward, then proposing a fine or imprisonment would have been a lie.
But this is where the calculation becomes so clear. If he genuinely wanted to survive or even just accept a manageable penalty, he had options. His wealthy friends, like Crito, they immediately suggested a realistic fine of 30 drachmas. Yet Socrates risks the death sentence by leading with the Prytaneum claim first. Why? Because the dramatic insistence on the reward, followed by the refusal to propose imprisonment or exile, it meant he was rejecting the core premise of the conviction. He explicitly refused to offer any lesser punishment because that would imply he was a wrongdoer, and adika, meaning he would admit his life's philosophical work was a crime. By forcing the jury to choose only between rewarding him or killing him, he ensured that if they thought he deserved any punishment at all, death was the only door left open. That is a masterclass in strategic framing.
Okay, if we're discussing honesty, we have to look at the overall structure of his defense. Was his rhetorical strategy purely driven by philosophical consistency, or was it a calculated attempt to craft a historical narrative? I maintain that his strategy was driven by philosophical consistency applied to a legal setting. His engagement with the prosecutor, Miletus, was pure Socratic method, attempting to dismantle the charges using rigorous logic. He demonstrated that intentionally corrupting the youth is, well, it's irrational, as it would inevitably harm the corrupter himself. And furthermore, his dismantling of the impiety charges, showing that believing in spiritual agencies, daemons, necessarily implies a belief in the divine, that was a sophisticated, methodical attempt to establish his innocence using his characteristic dialectical technique. He was aiming for truth and justice.
That's a compelling point regarding the dialectical method, I'll grant you that. But his strategic moves went far beyond mere defense of the charges. He introduced the first accusations, the long-standing rumors about him being a natural philosopher or a sophist, not to address the indictment, but to reshape his public image. He deliberately transformed the negative connotation of being a wise man who studied nature into a positive one concerning human virtue, a status confirmed by the oracle at Delphi. This self-elevation and narrative control, making himself the unique moral assessor of Athens, suggests the primary goal was securing his historical legacy. He was creating the martyr narrative for philosophy, knowing full well his acquittal was unlikely in the very short time allotted by the Athenian court system.
But securing the reputation of philosophy is a public service. It's consistent with his divine mandate. It's not a selfish act. And moreover, we cannot ignore the spiritual authority he appeals to. The most comprehensive philosophical account emphasizes the role of the daimonion, his inner divine sign, which consistently signaled when he was about to do something wrong, often stopping him mid-sentence. Crucially, the text states the daimonion did not oppose him at any point during the trial, either in his defense or his final statements. This lack of opposition is presented as proof that the path he chose and its fatal outcome was something good, implying divine approval for the whole direction he took.
I find that reading of the daimonion a little problematic. That inner voice only ever forbade action. It never commanded a specific strategy. So his choice to proceed with an inflammatory defense remains his own responsibility. The calculation is visible in how he meticulously distinguished himself from the sophists, the professional teachers who charged money. By constantly highlighting his own poverty and lack of payment, he protected his reputation from the taint of financial self-interest, ensuring his mission was viewed as pure conviction, not some professional enterprise. That's not simply following a divine command. That's carefully crafting the narrative for posterity.
The distinction from the sophists is certainly key to his integrity, but to understand his unyielding position, we have to address the authority of the sources that frame this choice. The account focusing on philosophical justification is a much more full and philosophically nuanced portrait. While it can be poetic, it is considered one of the strongest early texts, written shortly after the trial, capturing the authentic Socratic voice before his student used him as a mouthpiece for, later doctrines. The complexity of Socrates' principled argument, the idea that virtue is knowledge, and therefore he cannot fear what he doesn't know, like death, is fully reflected here.
And I find myself skeptical of relying on the most, let's say, idealized version of the account.
While the philosophical justification is comprehensive, the alternative historical source, despite its brevity, provides a clear, decisive motivation for the perceived arrogance, the fear of old age, and moral decline. This is a credible, deeply human explanation for a calculated strategy coming from an observer who was deeply concerned with the practical biography of the man. The historical account cuts directly to a difficult-to-digest but highly plausible personal choice for self-determination. Why must Socrates be a purely abstract ideal? Shouldn't we credit the very real human desire to control the narrative of one's own death?
Because the philosophical stakes are just too high. The biographical intent of the alternative source often seeks to rationalize controversial choices. The strength of the philosophical account is that it provides the conceptual framework, why fear of decline, or even fear of death, is philosophically unfounded for a virtuous man. Only this account fully explains why Socrates insisted on such an uncompromising line. His actions transform a local injustice into a universal statement about the supremacy of the examined life over all else. He was sacrificing his body to save his principle.
But the decision to die on one's own terms can also be a powerful philosophical statement, one that avoids the diminishing effects of time. The historical account reminds us that Socrates was not just an idea. He was a 70-year-old Athenian facing the loss of his mental acuity. The strategic choice to exit at his peak, thereby immortalizing his moral reputation, allows his philosophy to endure untainted by potential failure. This strategy is also a profound act of self-determination.
Ultimately, Socrates' defense was the final, defining demonstration of a life lived according to principle. His death was the logical, necessary consequence he embraced without fear, knowing, as he said, that nothing bad can happen to a good person, either in life or when he comes to its completion. This unyielding commitment to the mandate of the god and the superiority of truth, that defines his legacy.
Conversely, the evidence supports the claim that Socrates consciously chose the moment and manner of his death. By using his defense to strategically maximize his impact and provoke the jury, exploiting their biases and forcing them into a false binary choice, he ensured he avoided the dishonor of moral decay and cemented a legacy that continues to inspire us today.
The source material provides us with two profound yet differing interpretations of heroism, one defined by the pure unwavering adherence to principle regardless of the consequence,
and the other by calculated self-determination. And it really illuminates the magnitude of the choice Socrates faced, and suggests there's much more to explore in understanding the relationship between philosophical rigor and the human desire for control over one's ultimate fate.